Esther, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is Esther Meek, and I'm a philosopher. And I'm recently, uh, I have an additional uh, adjective after my title. I am now Professor Emeritus, which means that I can work on writing and speaking full time. So that's where I am in life. And I especially like to try to make philosophy accessible to all of us because I think all of us are philosophical. And I try to be creative and playful in that process and write books that most people will read. Of course, that's a bit of a trick, but
Unless you're Stephen Hawking or something, right?
I'm sorry?
Unless you're Stephen Hawking, right?
Right.
So the topic today was God and covenant epistemology. Could you tell me more about that? What is covenant epistemology?
Well, I guess I want to tell you a little bit more about my story, and that is that growing up in a house that was professingly Christian and reading the Bible and doing what I thought it said, I got to the age of 13 and found myself with some questions that at the time I felt were sin. And I didn't exactly tell other people about them, but one was, how do I know that God exists? And the other was, really, how do I know that there's anything outside of my mind? So, and that latter one seemed the larger question. And it seemed like I really needed some proof, and there was simply no way to have any. So I didn't realize for another few years that my questions were philosophical and not, sin. And then it took me another few years to figure out that you could actually study philosophy. And when I did find that out, it took me 12 hours to make up my mind that I needed to do it. And I changed my whole course of study and transferred colleges and all of that to start on my quest. And I rightly presumed that those questions were philosophical and that I needed to do a lot of philosophical work and ought to, just out of obligation because of the importance of the questions. But it took a long time to get to the place where I felt like I could offer a response to them. But I felt like that's what I needed to do. Part of what took a long time was, having a family and raising babies and that sort of a thing. So it really wasn't until my late 40s that I actually got to teach something like this and then start to put it together for myself. And that first attempt came out in 2003, and that's called Longing to Know, the Philosophy of Knowledge for Ordinary People. And the title reflects my, stipulation to myself that I want to talk to everybody, because that's to do honor to everybody. And rather than have kind of an inside guild sort of a conversation. But then it all really was me trying to work out and justify my own Christian belief to myself. And in particular, what I needed was an alternative presumption about how knowing works, which I actually got the kernel of from Michael Polanyi back when I was 23 or 4. And I found he's a premier scientist turned philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century. And I found his proposals of how scientific discovery work and how knowing has to work for discovery to happen. I found them applicable in a very healing sort of way to all knowing, including my own knowing God. So I've gone on to augment Polanyian epistemology into what I call covenant epistemology, but I don't ever really leave the kernel of what he called subsidiary focal integration behind, because I think it's just so key and so healing. But what covenant epistemology means, and that develops out of longing to know into my book, Loving to Know, which is where I propose and develop covenant epistemology. Covenant epistemology being my proposal about how we know. And it's to the point that the paradigm of knowing is not the knowledge as information paradigm that is prevailing in modernity, but it's rather something transformative and relational, and a relationship that has covenantal parameters to it. So something that involves responsible pledge to the end of interpersoned encounter that's mutually transformative. So that's the thesis of covenant epistemology.
Okay, and how do you ground knowledge in it? How do you use it to think that we can have knowledge of the external world and we're not solipsists?
Yeah, that's a great one. Well, I I think perhaps the simplest conclusion I've come to is to say that my very skeptical questions were endemic to the presumption, the modernist presumption about knowledge as focal information. And what Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration teaches, or it doesn't even teach it, it just shows you that you're already doing this if you're just even riding a bike or perceiving, is you have to entrust yourself to subsidiarily indwell clues that at that point you can't put into words, and you have to rely on them in order to get lined up in position to open the world to you. And so that involves submission, involves a kind of obedience to what you do not yet know, and a kind of putting yourself into position to invite reality to come. And then reality comes graciously. Uh, not it's not guaranteed, but you're putting yourself in a kind of like a covenantal pledge to it. I think of it knowing as kind of like a marriage. You promise to love, honor, and obey, and then you're graced to have reality self-disclose. So that's a little bit more about how I think knowing works. And I'd say it works that way in every discipline. So athletics, therapy, business, artistry, which is what I'm writing about now. Um, I just think that's how knowing works. And so I spend my life finding examples and making my students find examples, which they can everywhere.
So does that mean something like you act as if it's true and it happens, and if it happens in the way that you believed it, it's you know it or something?
Uh, I'd say that's a misleading caricature of what I just said. Um, I would say there is a sense in which you have to risk yourself to entrust yourself to what you do not yet know. And, Polanyi's expertise as a discoverer, discovery was his job, is, what kind of put the lie on the knowledge as information mindset for him paradigm. Because if knowledge is information, no scientific discovery could ever happen, is what he said. But it does. So we need to change our epistemology to something that involves personal investment, responsible risk, all kinds of hazard, no insurance policies. And yes, there's a sense in which, in inviting the real, as I call it, you have to start to live life on the terms of what you half understand. So, and that actually is part of inviting it. It's part of the pledge dimension in knowing. And I I don't truck in abstruse examples. I mean, I like to think about gardening and growing roses and riding bikes and driving cars and playing football. Not that I do, but I watch it. Yeah.
Well, I'm
It's
not
how
sure.
knowing works.
I'm not sure I understand how your definition of knowledge works exactly. So, like, I typically go with the JTB, justified true belief idea, and I don't see how adding in risk or personal injury uh, benefits that definition or what it does to improve it.
Well, let's start with the 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 T, as Marjorie Green, philosopher Marjorie Green did. Uh, and say, well, part of what we mean by true is it's kind of like a credo. So it is an affirmation. So everything that we claim to be true just is a truth claimed. And
What do you
so
mean? What do you mean everything? Like just a proposition, like it could be true or it could be false?
that's exactly what I don't mean, because truth is way more holistic than that. But truth isn't about correctness of propositions. And also, Polanyi the discoverer would say it's not, at the point that you make the discovery, you don't have justification. You later on go on to try to find it, but at the moment of contact with reality, as he calls it, what you have is a sense of possibility or hope of confirmation. So we don't we don't it isn't justification that makes it that we're in touch with the real. And so I guess I my approach to truth is more one of a skill, as Polanyi says, knowing is a skill, and it involves developing that skill to connect with the real. And I'd say our goal is connection and even communion with reality, which is going to be once a more of a lively interpersonal reciprocity that's going well.
Well, so like when I understand truth, I understand it to mean like correspondence to reality, that there's some sentence proposition. And if that sentence accurately describes reality, the sentence is true. I'm not sure I understand truth in the way that you're describing it. What would truth be in that context?
Well, the word truth is related to the word troth or pledge, and so there is something covenantal about a kind of a mutual promised sort of an encounter between the knower and the known that is actually mutually transformative, which I think is way richer and more three-dimensional than correctness of propositions. Also, part of what we're dealing with here is, a question of whether we have to work from uh, exclusively explicit propositions, which was exactly what Polanyi strove to deny, that can't possibly be what we rely on, or no discovery could ever happen, because we simply don't have them at the point that we're venturing toward the real. And then when we do connect in subsidiary focal integration, think of bike riding, for example. Keeping your balance on a bike is a great example of what Polanyi had in mind by subsidiary. And it's bodily felt, it's subsidiarily indwelled. It is in that moment inarticulable. And you just have to watch a 4-year-old learn to ride bike to know that. And so, the lovely thing about subsidiaries is they are both the foundation and they are inarticulable as the basis for knowing.
I'm not sure what you mean there because like we have artificial intelligences with neural networks that have learned how to ride a bike, and they can explicitly lay out propositions premise by premise, say this is how we did it. Here's how we weighted the biases. Here's exactly how we learned how to ride a bike. I mean, obviously for humans, our brain does most of that automatically. We don't like deliberately do any of that. But I don't understand how the process of knowing is different than just the propositional truths version. So like if I say the moon is 255,000 miles away, if the moon is 255,000 miles away, we can bounce ham radio signals off it, and it'll take like 2.5 seconds to get there and back, and because the speed of light is whatever the speed of light, 299,000 kilometers per second or whatever. I'm not seeing why we need to add any kind of conviction or what could affect us in some way, or any kind of bike riding analogy to that information to make it useful in any way.
Well, that's probably true. If you're talking about of usefulness, and information, that's one thing. I think it's another thing to talk about knowledge and understanding. And the AI riding a bike, I would tend to agree with, well, I would agree with Polanyi's critique of what in his day he called cybernetics, which is the idea that knowledge is ultimately formalizable. And he would argue that ultimately it isn't, that it's got to be fundamentally unformalizable. And that's because of the richness of our connectedness with the real.
What would
And
be the problem with like the law of identity, A equals A? Why is that not formalizable?
well, that is a formalization, but our understanding of it is not. So our grasp of it is, there's more to it than that. Yes, you can. There's a physics formula for keeping your balance on a bike. Uh, Presumably, whoever programmed the AI built that in, right?
What was
But
it? Neural networks, so it learned it itself, it made it up.
well, your neural networks are part of your personhood. They're subsidiary to your personhood, which I think is essential to knowing. That's why Polanyi called his work personal knowledge.
I mean, I would agree. I think that there's some medium that has to maintain the knowledge, some system of a brain or a computer chip or whatever that must function to maintain the knowledge. You can't just have it innately or whatever. But I don't see why I can't know the moon is 255,000 miles away from bouncy light off of it, radio waves off of it.
I didn't say you couldn't, but I'm saying it's the actual knowing has got to be more than could be represented in statements.
I don't know
You've
what
got,
that
for
means.
one thing, you've got to affirm it. Then how are you going to reduce affirmation? In Polanyi's case, with regard to discovery, he spends extensive time arguing that even verification is a highly personed act. And
What is that?
for
What do you
him, the
mean?
context of discovery made a whole lot more sense of the what's going on in knowing, because the question is, how do you get from unknowing to knowing? That's the Mano dilemma that, as philosopher Marjorie Green says, she thinks Polanyi's the only one that ever solved it.
Well, what's the dilemma there? Like,
Either, what Mano said to Plato was, how can you come to know? Because either you don't know, in which case you don't know what direction to go in, or you do know, in which case you don't have to come to know. So if you take knowledge as focal information, explicit focal information, as Polanyi was arguing, there's no way scientific discovery could ever happen. So the live question with regard to knowing is, how do we come to know in the first place?
I'm curious what focal information means, but the way I'd say we come to know is I make a model in my head, a hypothesis, and if that hypothesis can accurately predict the future, like if I predict that a asteroid will come by the planet every 500 years and we test it and it does every 500 years, then I know that my hypothesis is correct. And so I say that's how I would come by knowing, is by confirmation of novel prediction.
Okay, so something like the scientific method.
Hmm.
Well, you know, for me as a child, actually, it was chemistry that I had embarked on before I found you could study philosophy. And I thought to myself, I can't do the scientific method, because how can I generate tentative hypotheses? And that, I think, was the epistemological rub. How do you come up with ideas in the first place? And how do you risk everything to follow them? And that's what I think Polanyi was talking about when he was focusing on discovery. How do you do that? And so what he said is what you've got is some sort of something in the future that or in the out there that you're groping toward in a subsidiary and creative sort of a way. And yes, you have these little steps along the way, but there isn't just like a hypothesis that kind of comes out of the blue as if it were generated by a machine.
What I'd say it's imagination. We kind of just make them up. Most of them are wrong. That's how I.
I would agree with that, but what I would do is I would embed imagination, following Polanyi, in the core of coming to know.
Not following how that
And
would.
not only imagination, but intuition too. And what he meant by an intuition was this sense of something that you're pursuing, that you can actually have a sense that you're getting closer to. That's what he meant. So he writes an article called The Creative Imagination, in which he distinguishes between what he defines intuition and imagination and talks about how absolute those are central to the epistemic act. And then you're getting way more at what goes on when we try to come to know than you are with the JTB model. I mean, you're looking what you want to pay attention to is something that happens miles earlier on the road of coming to know, which is how do you come to it in the first place?
I'm not sure why that's important because I think that how we come to it in the first place doesn't really matter. Like you could come to a hypothesis from shaking an 8 ball or a vision in a dream. There's a famous mathematician who did that. He had visions and dreams to come to his mathematical models, and they ended up being right. I think that how you come to a model doesn't really matter. What matters is how do you differentiate if that model is corresponds to reality or is just a figment of your imagination. And so once you come to the model, what's important is that methodology you use to differentiate imagination from reality, and the fact that you came to the model via imagination or via a vision from God or via dreams. I don't know if that's important at all.
Okay, I had a train of thought and I lost it. um, uh, okay. But I would also say, as you described what you do instead, Polanyi would have said that everything that you said also involves personal responsible risk. So you're deciding that a hypothesis is viable, and then you're designing tests to test it, and then your determination that the tests either support it or don't support it. All of those are highly personed acts that simply cannot be accounted for on a philosophical model of knowledge as information. That's what he would have said.
Why?
Uh, why did he say that?
No,
Because
why couldn't it be accounted for on an information-based model of knowledge? Because like I think that all of that could be accounted for in purely biological physical systems can do all of that without any consciousness whatsoever. I don't understand why that
it
wouldn't be
still
able to
takes
be.
somebody at the end of the whatever the system is to say that the system did it right. That takes a human person.
Well, I think animals can do this. They do this on their own.
Okay, all right, but I think what Polanyi would, and he spends a lot of time talking about animals and rooting it in this whole thing in regard to animals in his magnum opus, Personal Knowledge. The whole thing is still a subsidiary focal integrative structure that involves the sort of a in the person's case, it involves taking personal responsibility and taking the risk with regard to discovery.
Well, I mean, I think you could say that
We
about.
we under credit. If you're going to get to I'm sorry, AI. You have to have de uh, like two-dimensionalized and seriously truncated what it is that you see persons as doing. And that's just the sort of thing that Polanyi felt would, if science kept to it, no scientific discovery would actually happen. In fact, in point of fact, it is the case that we as humans do what he called subsidiary focal integration, whether we misdescribe or not. It happens, and it involves responsible uh, involvement of the person that has a covenantal dimension, has a lot of risk, and it has a whole lot of things that we subsidiarily indwell in the way of clues that we cannot put into words.
Well, like I see plants also have that same risk. They have the same investing in things, but they have no knowledge. Like there's plants that walk or plants that um, Venus flytraps that have actions. And so the fact that they have some input of information and then respond to that input of information in a way that if it fails, they're going to die. I mean, they have that too, but they don't have knowledge. So that the fact that we have risk doesn't really seem to have anything to do with knowledge. I just think, I mean, I think knowledge is having an idea in your head. And if that idea has some justification, corresponds to reality, you have knowledge, even if it has no risk involved. So, like, I believe that Alpha Centauri is a galaxy that is X number of light years away. Like that involves zero risk on my part. There's nothing that involves any risk in believing that, but I still think it's knowledge.
Oh, okay. How about, we might call it, I guess there's a couple of things I'd like to distinguish between. For one thing, in covenant epistemology, I have argued that there is something person-like to the real. And so you should expect plants and animals to be doing something like that. And what's more, it happens between us and like me and my garden. There's a reciprocity that's going on. And that's what I kind of tease out as kind of a dance of overture and response of mutuality. And so I guess I don't have a problem with that. And I I guess I would challenge respectfully your claim that that statement about Alpha Centauri is a piece of knowledge because it doesn't do you credit. I think what does you credit is when you say, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise," and you are subsidiarily relying on what it is that you're claiming. You're actually indwelling it. So if my words are making sense right now, it's because you're subsidiarily indwelling them. If there's something that you're affirming, it's almost like you're wearing it in a subsidiary sort of way to open communion with the real. So I guess I think there's a good value in making knowing a way richer experience than two-dimensional yes or no information caricatures it as.
So would that mean that it's knowing that fact those wouldn't be knowledge to have basic facts like Alpha Centauri is a star X number of light years away? That just would that just not qualify as knowledge under your definition?
Well, let's be clear that what I'm doing is talking about the paradigm of knowing. And the question about knowledge as information is not that there's anything wrong with information, but whether it's a paradigm for knowing. So the problem is epistemological, not about information, whatever, right? So uh, I'm saying that if you want to be a great knower, which as a discoverer, somebody like Polanyi wanted to be, you would do better to install what I think is the more natural interperson human paradigm, more natural paradigm, which is something that looks more relational and interpersoned and mutual.
Or could you give an example of like a problem that your model could answer that the other model can't or something? Some example of a benefit or advantage or some issue that it can't solve?
Well, take for example Wendell Berry, the farmer. saying you don't go to a field and tell it what to grow. You go to the field and ask it, "What do you need?" That's kind of the epitome of rich knowing.
I don't understand. So, like, I would say that the most successful farmer ever was Norman Borlaug. He genetically modified wheat and then made it to work for all of the fields. So it wasn't he didn't ask the fields anything. He's like, I'm just going to make a genetically modified plant that works everywhere.
Well, Wendell Berry would say that's a problem.
Why is
Any
that?
farmer would know that. That's what he would say.
A, he's,
I'm
he's,
not a farmer, but that all of his work uh, is in support of what I'm just saying.
I'm not so Norman Borlaug is known as the man who saved a billion lives because of his genetically modified plants that created wheat and rice that could feed people that before they had no plants that could grow there. So I don't like that seems like a disadvantage to your model if it would say that that's a problem.
Well, I don't know enough to argue with you on that, but I would say there seems to be plenty of evidence to for people to have issues with genetically modified anything. I live in a community that's rife with. In fact, there's a big conference here this week about healing the land. so, so you know, um, uh, it coming down to something I understand more, and that's my garden. I'm not the most devoted gardener in the world, but I know there's certain things that are good for my plants and other things that are not so good, and I do make decisions, and I do I do something more like attending to and listening to the garden to treat it with integrity as I would a person.
What is that like? How does that affect knowledge? So if we have two farmers or two gardeners, one uses my model and just reads the fact sheet data and uses GMOs to modify their plants, and one uses your approach. Like what's the dip? Why would one person know more than another or be more successful than another?
Well, I would say the goal of humanness and personhood is communion with the real, not mastery over it. So I'm going to some I'm building into my assumption of knowing that it is mutually healing for the world.
I would have the opposite intuition that the purpose of knowing is mastery over the nature. That's kind of like the whole point of science for the most part is mastery over nature. It seems like a disadvantage to think that it's I don't know what you mean by communion in this case, but I think that mastery is the goal.
Well, that is the modernist ideal. You're speaking the language of modernity. That's what Father Bacon and Father Descartes how they set up what modernity is. I do not concur.
Well, why? To me, that seems like a better way to do things. Like the goal is to have mastery so that we don't die of old age or cancer or so that
Yeah,
we
well,
don't
so
have
what that does, if you say knowledge is power,
yeah.
or if you say that the goal is utility, then really what that does is evaporate knowledge. Knowledge is not loved for its own sake. And, it's great for utility, it's great for mastery, but the question is whether we want that as a paradigm time of our knowing. And if we do, knowing self-destructs.
I don't
It just
understand how it
we no longer
self-destructs.
talk about knowledge, we just talk about power and mastery,
I mean, I don't
which
understand how it self-destructs. Like to have mastery, you have to have knowledge, right? I don't think you can have mastery without knowledge. It'd be very strange. Like I'm a master. I'm top rated in several video games, presumably because I have knowledge about how the video games work. Um, I don't think it's just luck or something. So I don't understand why prioritizing mastery and utility damages knowledge in any way. I don't think the motive of why you pursue knowledge in any way affects the truth of the knowledge.
well, remember that what I'm talking about is what the paradigm of knowing is, right? So, uh, uh, and what I'm saying is that it's something more relational and mutually transformative.
What do you
Rather,
mean by the paradigm of knowing? What does that mean?
if you want to be a great knower, you want to do it this way.
I'm not quite understanding. Like, you want to be a great knower. Like, it seems like that's circular in the fact that you're defining great as having this paradigm. But if you define being a great knower as someone who can use knowledge to achieve some ends, um, then either way still seems to achieve the goal of knowing to some extent. And so if you want to say who has more knowledge, the one who is a great knower in your sense, or the one who has more mastery over knowledge and can control the universe, I would say the one that can control the universe has more knowledge.
Okay, so there's some slippage going on here. First of all, on the characterizations you did of my approach and the characterization you did about of the alternative approach, they were both equally circular because they were definitive. Okay, so the one's just as circular as the other, and then when you are then holding it up to say, well, which one has the more knowledge, you still are employing one understanding of knowledge rather than another.
Well, I'd
So
agree with the first part. So definitely they're both circular because I'm just saying hypothetically, if you have one presumed definition of what it means to be a good knower, I can just provide an alternative definition of what it means to be a good knower, and they're both equally circular. They're both, there's nothing that shows one is more right than another. And then I would say that there is probably some methodology to show one is more right than another, in that if they have the ability to interact with those facts and have them have some discernible effect in reality, specifically controlling nature would be one example, then that would be a way to establish who has more knowledge. Like, if I can do more stuff with the knowledge and do it more accurately, that seems to imply that I have more knowledge. And so that would be a way to tell which definition is more accurate, I think.
yeah, well, what you're doing is you're setting up the ideal of modernity, which is utility and mastery. And I'm saying that is counter to shalom or peace. And you know, when I speak of communion, I do mean something interpersonally peaceable and mutually flourishing. And I'm also saying that we want to love knowledge for its own sake, not for the sake of what it gets for us. So once you talk about mastery and utility, you have just obviated knowledge, I think. Knowledge has to do with loving what is there. And, you know,
Why?
if
Is that
I
just
lo-
like, or just is that just like your definition of knowledge that it entails love? Is there, because I don't follow why that would be a part of the definition of knowledge or knowing.
well, that's part of what my proposal is, you know, and it, you know, if you want to see it circularly, you can. I think with regard to any approach, uh, you know, a key way of arguing is developing it wide enough so that it seems to make sense of lots of things. And so that's what I've done. And so I have argued that we do not know in order to love; we love in order to know. And so love is core to knowing. And I would say if you contrast utility and love, uh, the utility obviates knowing, whereas love makes it better,
Better in
makes it
what way?
more itself. It makes it more itself, which I'm defining as communion with the real. We're made, I think we're made to be lovers of the real. We're made to love it for its own sake, not for mastery over it.
Because I would think that better would be longer life expectancy, better quality of life. Those kinds of things would be better,
I would
independent of.
oppose those two things that you just said, by the way. Life
Um,
expectancy and quality of life are two different things.
oh yeah, that's, I meant them as two different things. So I think both of those things would be um, good measurements of a better something, a better system of knowledge, if they led to those two things. So if you have a system of mastery, and that system of mastery can be used to improve the longevity of life and the quality of life, which are two different things, that system would be better because it can do this. Whereas opposed to defining better as more loving or something, if it didn't accomplish these things, I would not see it as good as the one that does improve those things.
Yeah. Well, there's more to life than our life expectancy, including things like truth, beauty, and goodness, where those have come to do with, have to do with communion with the real. That's what I would say is quality of life. And so I do think there has to be an openness to the transcendent.
Why?
Uh, because if you don't have it, you're being premeditatively religious by cutting out and saying there is no transcendent.
Well, I'd say that there's a possibility of the transcendent, but there's no evidence to support it, and there's good evidence against it. And so I lean like there's not evidence of the transcendent, but I think I can still have knowledge and beauty and love and meaning and purpose and morality. I don't think I need the transcendent for any of those things. I don't think I need the transcendent for knowledge. I don't understand why I would.
Well, I'm looking at you and you're a beautiful human being.
Thank
And
you.
in yourself, it seems to me like to me you're a proof that there is way more to life than life expectancy and power.
Well, I would agree. I don't think all of life is defined by knowledge, but I think what makes a system of knowledge better is if it can improve life expectancy, happiness, whatever the individual wants.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna redo that. Just thinking if I were to have an orchard, uh, productivity of a kind of the kind of the top of the line, sort of make this thing as productive as possible, is gonna not be the best thing for the tree, and it's not gonna be the best thing for productivity in the long term. Whereas I think something that has something of what I'm talking about in covenant epistemology is uh, uh, more conducive to reality's health.
That still seems like a utility argument. You're saying your position would have more utility than this other one for some reason.
No, I'm saying you want the communion for its own sake. Yes, there's a payoff. In fact, the payoff is to, actually make your information better. It becomes truer to attend to the thing just for its own sake. I'm not conversant with her work, but reports of I can't remember now the Nobel Prize winner with regard to genetics and corn. She argues you've got to have a feeling for the organism and a kind of respect for the organism that honors it as different, and put yourself in a position of listening to it. That's all covenantal language, and that's to be a great scientist, to do right by an ear of corn.
I don't know what that means because a lot of the people who win Nobel Prizes are very analytic. Like I have high functioning autism and they're like me and they don't care at all about the plants. They're just like, these are the facts. We're done. We don't care about any of that meaning and purpose stuff. It's just here's how it works.
Yeah, sad. That's sad.
Why is that
That's real.
sad?
Well, it reduces you to a robot, and it has so much disrespect for the world out there, so much disrespect for whatever it is. I think one of the things that has happened in modernity is modernity disavowed lots of things like wonder and also philosophy and also reality. And so, lots of people, lots of students I know just have huge, huge questions about whether reality is even there and does it even matter? And I'm sad about that because I think we're made to love it and let it be its flourishing self and help it to be more its flourishing self. I think lots of things that you and I, uh, there's lots of things that approaches that anybody could agree on as to what that looks like. But what I'm arguing as a philosopher is what makes more sense of our actual knowing as we're born into it and as we live it out, as in something like discovery for Polanyi. Uh, if you want to do it better and do right by the knowing and the real, it would look more like an interpersonal relationship and less like rape.
I'm not sure. Like to take one of the recent scientific discoveries of a mosquito. They genetically modified a mosquito so that it can't carry malaria. And if they release this mosquito into the wild, then it'll just cure malaria because none of them will be able to hold it. Now, I don't consider this discovery to be beautiful or majestic or enthralling in any way. But do you think adding those feelings makes it truer in some sense?
I wouldn't see what I'm doing as adding the feelings. What I keep saying I'm doing is propounding a different philosophical paradigm. And I would also say that, yes, part of our involvement with the world is trying to make it better. And I would suggest that uh, that approach with regard to a mosquito just actually might make it better for the mosquito. It might improve the mosquito.
Improve the mosquito. From the mosquito's perspective, they don't really care. It doesn't affect the mosquito at all. It only affects whether they can give us a disease. That's the only thing it changes.
Well, our job is to care for and cultivate the world, and that involves regard. It has to start with regard for what is there and how we can help it be more itself. So that's kind of built into what I think is our approach in knowing. I don't see our our job as collection of information pieces to the end of mastery. I just don't see that. Or if I do see it, I see it as the prevailing skewed paradigm of modernism, and I would like to uh, dissent from it.
So you mentioned that our purpose is to help nature be itself or something. Uh, Nature seems to be very bad, as far as I can tell. Most people die. Nature kills most people. 99.999% of the universe is uninhabitable to life. Nature seems to be not very great. It seems like the goal of humans would be to overcome nature and to change it such that it would be more habitable to life, not to help nature be itself, because nature being itself would most likely end life.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. But I would point out that what you're uh, uh, representing is an oppositional approach, whereas I'm going for something that's more communal and mutual.
How is that not like an appeal to motive fallacy? An appeal to motive being like your motive for why you interact with something makes it more true or false. It seems like the motive is independent of whether or not it's true or false.
Well, like I said, I think you've got if you're starting with a modernist understanding of what knowledge is, you've already divorced out of court emotion from it. And that's just the question, is whether it's possible or whether that's a legitimate account of how knowing works. And I would argue, following Polanyi and augmenting his work, that no, that whatever we take emotions to be and all of that, they are part of the subsidiaries that go into our um, uh, search for understanding. We've got to love the real. I don't think there's any scientist worth their salt who didn't actually start with love.
Well, there
And I
are.
don't mean something fuzzy. I mean a desire for the real.
Well, what about the robots that have made scientific discoveries and have no emotions?
Well, I guess I would say you don't have a robot if you don't have a human to make them and interpret what they're doing. So it just kinda, you know, attempts to remove the whole question of knowledge from the human person, into an already artificial framework that was set up by the human person to begin with.
So if we had neural networks that designed themselves and learned stuff, would that falsify your hypothesis?
Uh, I I suppose it might, but the whole point is that, that's just what I'm saying you don't have. What you've got is persons who, in their glory and their skill, design really sophisticated machines and tools to use in the world. They're
More,
cool. They're cool. They're really cool, but they're tools. And Polanyi says there's stuff we subsidiarily indwell as we connect with the world. He used to talk about, people came from all over the world to study in his lab, and multiple Nobel Prize winners came out of it, which is rare. And he would say, it can take years just to design the equipment. And then if somebody didn't, understand the equipment, they would break it in a second. So designing equipment to open reality to us is an incredible person feat.
oh, I think that with new technology, we're leaning to the fact that most of our designs will happen with neural networks and AIs doing it automatically with little human involvement. It seems like the processes and computers are doing a far better job at designing things than we are in very many fields, where we don't really have much control over anything other than the weights and biases of what we want. So,
Which is the person part.
well, it's just numbers. It's saying maximize this number, and that's all it does. And it maximizes the number.
Right, but it takes you to say why that's significant. It takes you to have made it in the first place.
Sure, but it still seems like the knowledge to say that this particular physical structure will maximize this number is already in the machine, and the machine can solve those problems we don't know. So we don't have this information. It has a goal of finding the information, does the process to find the information, which it makes up on its own, we don't know, and then tells us the information. But all of that seems to be knowledge and has no
That's what I would
emotion.
disagree with. It's a great tool, but it's not knowledge. It's great information, but it takes a human person to know. And that involves fundamentally a responsible, highly evaluative credo that says, this is true. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise.
All right. We got some questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Boots asks, what does it mean to become truer?
I would take that easily into meaning communion. So if my garden and I have a great working relationship, it's going to look better next spring. So in a sense, that's one thing that can be meant by truer. When we use the word true in our kind of ordinary way of talking, one is correctness, another is what a plumber does with a plumb line, and another is faithfulness and love.
Can
So
can someone hate a garden and still make it into a more beautiful garden?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Or if they start out that way, they're going to fall in love with the garden.
I think most occupied humans would disagree.
Most
People who have
occupied.
people who have jobs. Most people who have jobs hate their jobs, but they're decent at them. Um, Ray Rez
Well,
asked,
that's sad. That's not epistemology. That's sad. That
I,
means we have to change something about our jobs. We ought to do our jobs out of love.
I would
I'm
agree, but
sorry.
I
I
think that
know, I know, I know. But what are we arguing here? And I would say, if you're a geologist, it's that somewhere back in your childhood you fell in love with rocks.
I think that jobs are required because nature makes us need food and money to survive, and so we have to do jobs. And so I think the problem is nature that we need to change. And once we change nature, so we no longer need jobs, then nobody's going to do a job they don't enjoy. So I think the nature is the problem. Um,
Well, I would just argue that maybe if you think nature's the problem, communion might serve you better than mastery. And that starts with you as a human person.
Gotcha. Ray Rez asked, "Does science make the world a better place?"
I think it does, but we're talking philosophy here and epistemology. I think there's no guarantee that science makes the world a better place. And I'm saying that if you have a philosophical ideal of mastery, especially, it might not be particularly helpful. Sorry, I'm wrestling with a standing desk that keeps wiggling and going crooked. So I'm sorry, I'm jiggling all over the place.
No problem. Efont asks, "Does having autism, psychopathy, or a mental disorder prevent someone from having mastery?"
Well, I'm not the guru of mastery, so perhaps you should answer that.
Well, I would say no. I'd say some of those are some of the people who have the most mastery. There's a
I would say that, again, I know little in this area, but whatever we mean by autism, if there's a sensitivity there that puts us in touch with some things, that is something that looks like communion. But I honestly don't know enough to address that.
Yeah, I think autism is mostly it's very dispassionate, very calculating. There's studies that show that autism is connected with lower levels of empathy, and they're just very good at calculating stuff, whether they care about it or not.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing wrong with modernity is that it has opposed empathy and calculation. And we might do better at the calculation if we got back to the empathy. I mean, you have to realize that modernity has made these binary divorces. And, reason is here and then emotion is over there. Empathy doesn't even come on the modernist ideal of knowledge. In fact, what's propounded is disconnection, dispassionate connection, and which was part of Polanyi's big, that was one of his big issues. You've got to be passionate if you're going to be a discoverer.
Do you think having empathy would make someone a better mathematician?
I I guess I do because I think empathy is core to knowing well.
Hmm.
Absolutely core because it's core to communion.
All right. Queen Twitty asks, "When you work in the garden, you are stepping on thousands of bugs that would appreciate not dying. Would that be in conflict with your idea that it's a communion because you're killing bugs?"
Well, that's a great question. And I'm not sure, I'm sure I don't have a final answer to that. I do know that there's some things that you got to save and there's some things that you got to get rid of for the sake of the things that you want to save. And that's the way it is. And so you got to set boundaries. And that seems to be part of our task as human persons is just to decide what just boundaries are best we can.
Gotcha. Mike Winter asks,
Example, I am so mad that down the street right now, where there was this beautiful hedge of junipers, they are dying because of what are those things? Tent worms? What are those? Now I'm forgetting what they are. Which one? It's not tent worms. Bag. So they're little bags. And
bagworms.
bagworms. Okay, maybe that's it. Having dealt with them in my garden in the past, I have learned to eschew them. So,
Gotcha. Mike
could there
Winter asks,
be somebody in the world who wants to save the bagworms? I guess so, but I think that's where the variety in our loves comes to bear, and a good community means that we have to work together a little creatively to pull something off that's a flourishing community.
Gotcha. Mike Winter asked, do you think truth is subjective?
I begin by rejecting the binaries uh, that are endemic to modernity. And then I would say about truth that it is, uh, in a way more three-dimensional way, something that I am responsibly personally involved with, and that in a person-like way also is involved with me. I think that you can distinguish subjectivity as something really subpar with regard to communion and say, okay, that's a problem. That person's being too subjective. They're not seeing it, you know, the way others see it, right? And that's inhibiting their understanding of the real. But I would say, uh, and again, this is just the heart of Polanyi's message. Let's stop talking about personal involvement as subjectivity. It's responsible risk, and it involves way more than we're able to put into words, and tacit powers, as he called them, that are essentially unformalizable.
Gotcha.
And, I guess maybe, by comparison, another question would be, well, is your relationship with your best friend subjective? Well, I think you would wanna say that subjective is too mean and lowly a word, but your heart is caught up with this person.
Okay. Um, Brother of the Flying Man asked, oh, that's not the right. Nature, but be itself, the brain eating amoebas, predation, pubic lice. Should we prioritize these things, lives?
Well, I think all of us have to decide what's right and good and just, and that's our privilege as human persons in this world. And that brings me back to the idea of setting boundaries. I love lighthouses, and lighthouses are built decisively by human persons who feel that rocks need to be called attention to for the sake of ships. So it's like and then you build jetties, and build sand dunes and all of those things to protect a boundary. And we can't help but make decisions. We can't help but be high-handed. That's our job as human persons. Um, but our goal is for the flourishing of all, the just as best we can do it.
Gotcha. Logical Arguments asks, which covenant is this referring to, supposed to relate to?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I've developed the idea of covenant as, first of all, a relationship, but one that's got this covenantal or pledged structure to it. So it would be any sort of relatedness that has a pledged structure. So it can be your spouse, or it can be the person you're sitting next to on the airplane. I'm not saying those are the same at all in the way of covenants, but they have a bit of a structure of pledge. When you're in a airplane seat, your obligation is to let the other person go to the bathroom and maybe hold their hand if the plane is going down. Obviously your covenant to a spouse or to a child is unutterably rich. But I think our involvement with the real always has what I would call normative, pledge like dimensions to it. And that's what I'm arguing is uh, a key to the paradigm of uh, knowing that I'm propounding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same guy also asked, what does emotion add to truth that isn't there already?
Well, I would say if you start with a modernist idea of knowledge as divorced from emotion, there's no way that you can answer that question. And I would say the way this question is set up presumes the modernist model of knowledge. I think the first thing you have to do is torpedo that, and I think that's what Polanyi's idea a description of how we know a subsidiary focal integration does. It does
What
that.
is that word? What does that mean? Subsidiary focal information? What does that mean?
Well, Polanyi said that all knowing has a from to subsidiary focal integrative structure. And I always, when I talk, I usually spend the first hour talking about what that means and helping people see it in all that they do. But what we do is we entrust ourselves to half understood clues. We try to indwell them. That's Polanyi's word to invite the gracious inbreaking of a farther integrative pattern. It isn't knowledge is not linear, and it doesn't happen in a forward way. It happens kind of backwards. So insight breaks in, and in retrospect transforms what we were relying on to make them meaningful in terms of the pattern. That's what a
Gotcha.
discovery would be.
Okay.
So that you can see how that's led me to talk in terms of something like covenant and relationship.
All right. Super Squid Hunt asks, can you sum up your epistemology in 10 words or less, or a few sentences?
Well, the definition of covenant epistemology is that the best paradigm of knowing is the interpersonal, covenantally constituted, transformative relationship.
Okay. And last question, Brother of the Flying Man asks, have you ever seen wild naturally occurring corn or bananas? And do you think this is where what we get in the grocery store at farmers? I think he's referring to the
Yeah,
claim that.
I obviously you're touching on a really important and timely and wide-ranging conversation that people with way more expertise than I ought to have. But if you'd like to come to the Healing Land conference this weekend in my town, I'm sure you'll have people to talk with.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we've been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you have any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. First of all, thanks for having me and inviting this conversation. My website is my name, Esther Lightcap Meek. And what I try to do and what books I've written are described in brief there. And that would be a way for you to subscribe to my work and go farther with the conversation. And, inviting the real and means for me also inviting readers. So I'd appreciate that.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.